The moment I realized my land wasn't mine to them was when I heard tires on gravel I hadn't invited. The crunch woke me before the sun did. A slow, deliberate grind of rubber against loose stone rolling across 60 acres that had been mine for exactly 12 hours, and I knew that sound didn't belong there. Not on land I'd paid cash for. Not on dirt that still smelled like fresh paperwork and freedom. I pushed open the back door and the cold morning air hit me with that dry Texas dust taste. The kind that sticks to your tongue, and there it was, a line of headlights cutting straight through my property like it had always been a road, like I had just bought the inconvenience instead of the land, trucks, sedans, even a white SUV gliding across my back field in a steady stream. Not slowing, not hesitating, like I was invisible, like the man standing barefoot on his own porch didn't exist. My name's Ethan Caldwell, 38, contractor turned land investor, and after 10 years of HOA letters, fines, and people telling me what color my mailbox could be, I bought these 60 acres. Just outside Willow Creek Estates to get away from all of it. No rules, no committees, no one measuring my grass with a ruler, just land, open sky, and silence, or at least that's what I paid for. What I got was a highway I didn't build. I stepped down onto the gravel, the small stones biting into my feet, and watched as another car passed, the driver barely glancing my way, coffee cup in one hand, phone in the other, like this was his morning routine, like I was just part of the scenery. I raised a hand, not even sure what I was signaling, stop, slow down, acknowledge me, anything, but he didn't. None of them did. The line kept moving, smooth and confident, like ownership meant nothing compared to habit. And that's when I noticed the tire tracks, deep grooves carved into the dirt. Not new, not from this morning, they were worn in, packed down from months, maybe years of use, a path that cut straight from the HOA subdivision on the east side of my land to the county road on the west, a perfect shortcut, saving them a good 10 minutes of looping around the main entrance, 10 minutes they'd clearly decided was worth more than my property rights. I followed the tracks with my eyes all the way to the fence line, or where a fence should have been, nothing but open ground, no barrier, no sign, just a silent invitation someone else had accepted on my behalf. And then I heard her before I saw her, the soft hum of a luxury engine, smooth, controlled, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything because it already thinks it owns the road. The white SUV slowed. As it approached me, finally, a break in the stream, the window rolled down with a quiet mechanical whisper. And there she was, Victoria Hale. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew the type instantly. Perfect hair, pressed blouse, sunglasses that cost more than my first truck, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked me up and down like I was a temporary inconvenience, something that would sort itself out if ignored long enough. "You must be the new owner," she said, voice smooth, practiced, like she'd had this conversation 100 times before. I nodded, still tasting dust and disbelief. "This is private property," I said, keeping my voice even, steady. "The way you talk when you're giving someone a chance to correct a mistake." Her smile didn't change, not even a flicker. "Oh, this road." She glanced past me at the worn path cutting through my land, then back at me. "It's been used by the community for years. It's really the most efficient way through." Efficient, like she was talking about traffic flow, not trespassing, like convenience rewrote ownership. Another car pulled up behind her. Then another, the line stacking, engines idling, waiting for her to move. She didn't seem bothered. She leaned her arm casually on the door, completely at home on land she didn't own. "You'll get used to it?" she added, like she was doing me a favor, like this was part of the package I hadn't read in the fine print. I looked past her at the line of cars, at the path carved into my soil, at the morning sun just starting to light up land that was supposed to be mine, and something settled in my chest, not anger, not yet, something colder, sharper, the kind of realization that doesn't shout, it just clicks into place. They weren't asking. They weren't even pretending to ask. To them, this wasn't my land. It was their shortcut, and I was just the guy standing in the way of it. I stood there until the last car disappeared over the rise, the sound of engines fading into that hollow quiet that comes after something wrong settles in like it belongs. And for a second I just listened to the wind moving across my land, trying to remember what silence was supposed to sound like. But even that felt different now, like the ground itself had already accepted this as normal. I walked the length of that dirt path slowly, boots crunching where tires had already packed the soil. Flat, and every step told the same story. This was not occasional use, this was routine, daily, predictable, something they relied on, something they had built their schedules around. I crouched down and ran my fingers through the grooves. The dirt was compacted hard, almost polished in places, weeks of pressure, maybe months, maybe longer, and I could see where the grass had given up trying to grow back, like it knew it was never going to win this fight. The smell of dry earth mixed with a faint trace of motor oil hung low to the ground, and I followed it all the way to the edge where my property met the subdivision. No fence, no marker, just a clean break in the landscape where someone had decided my boundary did not matter. I turned back toward the house and pulled out my phone. Signal was decent out here, one of the reasons I bought the place, and I opened the county records site, fingers moving faster than my thoughts, pulling up the parcel map, zooming in until the lines snapped into focus. 60 acres, clean title, no shared access, no easements, no rights-of-way, nothing, just my name sitting there in black and white like it was supposed to mean something. I checked again, slower this time, scrolling through every line of legal description, every note attached to the property, looking for anything they could point to and say this is why we can do this, but there was nothing, not even a hint, which made the whole thing worse somehow because it meant they knew exactly what they were doing. They just did not care. The sun climbed higher and with it came the next wave, late commuters this time. A pickup with a ladder rack rattling in the back. A sedan with kids in the rear seats staring out the windows like this was just another part of their morning, and each one followed the same line, cutting straight through like I was not standing 10 feet away watching them. I raised my hand again, more deliberate this time, stepping closer to the path, forcing the next driver to at least slow down. He rolled his window halfway, not stopping, just enough to acknowledge that I existed. "You might want to talk to the HOA," he said, like he was giving directions to a gas station. Then he drove on, leaving me in a cloud of dust that tasted like someone else's routine. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. HOA, of course it came back to that. It always did, even out here, even after I paid extra to be outside their reach. They had found a way to stretch themselves just far enough to keep control of something that was not theirs. I walked back up to the house and leaned against the porch railing, the wood still warm from yesterday's sun, and looked out over the land that was supposed to be mine, 60 acres of rolling dirt and scrub and potential, cut clean in half by a path I never agreed to, and I started doing the math in my head, not money, not yet time, how long it would take to fix this, how long it would take before they realized I was not going to just get used to it. The answer came quick, faster than I expected, because this was not new to them, but it was new to me, which meant I still had the advantage they did not see. I was not tired of fighting yet, I was just getting started. I pushed off the railing and headed inside, the screen door slamming shut behind me with a sharp crack that echoed out across the property. A small sound, but it felt like a line being drawn, and for the first time since I heard those tires on gravel, the situation made sense in a way that was simple and clean. They had built their lives around something that did not belong to them, and they expected me to respect that, but I had spent too many years being told what I could and could not do on land I paid for, and I did not buy 60 acres to ask permission again. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter, the metal hitting the surface with a solid, final sound, and looked back out the window at the path cutting through my land like a scar. And I knew exactly what needed to happen next, not because I was angry, but because I was done letting someone else decide what mine meant. The hardware store bell gave a dull metallic ring as I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me instantly. Cut lumber, machine oil, dust that had been sitting on shelves longer than most people stayed in one place. The kind of place where things still had weight, where problems had physical solutions. I walked straight past the front counter, boots echoing on the concrete floor, already knowing what I needed before I even saw it, because I had built enough things in my life to understand one simple truth: if someone keeps using something that is not theirs, you do not argue about it, you control access to it. Steel, not wood, that was the first decision. Wood rots, wood breaks, wood invites negotiation. Steel does not care about opinions. I stopped in front of a rack of heavy-duty gate panels, each one solid, industrial, the kind used on ranch land, not decorative, not friendly, just clear, final, and I ran my hand along the cold metal, feeling the weight of it, imagining it, standing right where that dirt path cut through my property, a line that could not be ignored or driven over like a suggestion. The clerk wandered over, older guy, ball cap worn thin at the edges. He looked at the gate, then at me, then back at the gate again. "You putting up a perimeter or making a point?" he asked, not even trying to hide the smirk. I met his eyes for a second, then looked back at the steel. "Both," I said, and that was enough for him. He nodded once, like he had seen this exact situation play out before, like he already knew how it ended. The next hour moved fast, hinges rated for weight, reinforced posts, concrete mix stacked on a flatbed cart, a chain thick enough to make a statement even before it was locked, and a lock that felt heavy in my hand, solid, reliable, not something you snap open with a pair of bolt cutters. I paid cash, loaded everything into the back of my truck, and as I drove out, the tires hummed against the pavement. A different sound than gravel, smoother, temporary, because I knew I would be back on dirt soon, back on land that was about to change in a way they did not see coming. The drive back gave me time to think, not about whether this was the right move, that part was already decided, but about how long they had been doing this, how many mornings like today had played out before I ever showed up, how many times Victoria Hale had rolled through that path without a second thought, coffee in hand, schedule tight, life efficient, because someone else's property made it that way. I turned onto the county road and slowed as my land came into view, open, quiet, untouched except for that one scar cutting through it, and I could already picture where the posts would go, right at the narrowest point, where the ground naturally funneled traffic into a single line. No room to go around, no space to pretend there was another option, just a gate standing exactly where it needed to be. I parked, killed the engine, and for a second, everything went still again, no cars, no movement, just wind brushing across dry grass and the faint ticking of metal cooling under the hood. I stepped out and got to work, post holes first, the auger biting into the ground with a steady grind, dirt piling up in neat circles, sweat starting to build at the back of my neck as the sun climbed higher. The physical rhythm of it settled something in me, measure, dig, set, pour, each step deliberate, each action building towards something that did not need permission. By the time the first post stood upright, sunk deep and locked in place with wet concrete, I could already feel the shift, like the land itself was starting to push back. The second post went in. Faster, muscle memory taking over, the smell of fresh mixed concrete rising sharp and chalky in the heat, and I worked without stopping, without looking toward the road, because I knew they would come. Not if, when, the pattern was too ingrained for them to suddenly change, and I wanted it ready before the first engine broke that silence again. I lifted the gate into place, hinges sliding into position with a solid, satisfying weight, the metal settling between the posts like it had always belonged there, and for the first time since I bought this land, the path looked different, not like a road, not like an invitation, just a line that ended where I decided it ended. I stepped back, wiped my hands on my jeans, and reached into my pocket, pulling out the lock, the metal cool and heavy against my palm, and I held it there for a second, looking at the gate, at the land behind it, at the path that had been theirs without question just hours ago, and I could already hear it in my head, the brakes, the confusion, the frustration, the moment where routine meets reality and something has to give. I snapped the lock into place, the click sharp and final in the open air, and the sound carried farther than I expected, like it was announcing something to anyone who had been listening. And just as the echo faded, I heard it again, distant at first, then closer, the low hum of an engine coming down that same path, right on schedule. The engine grew louder, steady and confident, the same sound that had woken me up that morning. Only this time it carried a different weight because I knew exactly what it was about to meet. I did not move. I just stood there a few feet back from the gate, arms relaxed at my sides, watching the path as the white SUV came into view over the slight rise, sunlight flashing across the windshield for a split second before it dropped back down and rolled straight toward me like nothing had changed, like the last 12 hours had not happened, like the idea of something new standing in her way had not even crossed her mind. Victoria Hale did not slow at first, her posture behind the wheel loose, one hand at the top, the other holding a cup, routine, predictable, comfortable, and then the gate came fully into her line of sight, and everything shifted. Not dramatically, not instantly, just enough. Her foot eased off the gas, the SUV gliding forward on momentum, her head tilting slightly as if her eyes needed a second to process what they were seeing. The steel did not blend into the landscape the way dirt did. It stood out, hard lines, dark metal, a clear statement that something had changed overnight. The brakes engaged. Smoothly, the front of the vehicle dipping just a fraction as she came to a controlled stop less than 10 feet from the gate. The engine idling low, a soft hum filling the space between us. For a second she just sat there, staring straight ahead, like if she waited long enough the gate might disappear the same way a temporary inconvenience does. But steel does not disappear. I watched her shoulders tighten, just slightly, then the window slid down with that same quiet mechanical precision. And she leaned her head out, sunglasses still in place, scanning the gate, the posts, the chain, the lock, taking it all in piece by piece, calculating, adjusting, trying to fit this new reality into the version of the world she had been operating in. "What is this?" she asked, and there it was, not confusion, not even real curiosity, just irritation wrapped in a question, like the answer was already obvious and she was giving me one chance to fix it. I took a step closer, boots pressing into the dirt that no longer felt like a road. "It is a gate," I said, keeping my voice even, the same tone I had used that morning, calm, factual, no room for interpretation. Her lips pressed together for a moment, then curved into something that looked like a smile but carried none of the warmth. "You cannot just block access like this," she said, her voice tightening on the word cannot like it was a rule that applied universally, like ownership was something flexible when it inconvenienced her. Behind her another car rolled into view, then another, the line forming again out of habit, stacking up behind her without question. Because this was the path, this was how mornings worked, and they had no reason to think otherwise until right now. I glanced past her at the growing line, engines idling, drivers starting to lean forward, trying to see what the delay was. Then I looked back at her. "This is private property," I said, the same words, but this time they landed differently because now there was something physical backing them up, something that could not be driven through or ignored. Her smile tightened further, the edges sharpening. "This road has been used by the community for years," she said, repeating it like it was a legal argument, like repetition could turn habit into permission. I nodded once, slow, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "That does not make it yours," I replied, and for the first time there was a pause, a real one, not the controlled kind she had been using. Something slipped in her expression, not anger yet, something closer to disbelief, like she was finally realizing that this was not going to resolve itself the way it always had. A horn sounded lightly from somewhere behind her, not aggressive, just a reminder that people were waiting, that time was being lost, that convenience was being interrupted, and she glanced in her rearview mirror for a fraction of a second before looking back at me, the control she was used to having starting to crack around the edges. "You are creating a problem for a lot of people," she said, her tone shifting slightly, less authority, more pressure, like she was trying a different angle. I could smell the faint hint of expensive perfume carried on the air from her open window, sharp, artificial, layered over the smell of dust and metal, two different worlds colliding in a space that suddenly felt much smaller. I shrugged lightly, not dismissive, just honest. "I am fixing one," I said, and the words settled between us heavier than anything else that had been said, because they made it clear that this was not temporary, not negotiable, not something I was going to back away from once it became inconvenient. Another horn sounded, a little louder this time, the line behind her growing restless, and she straightened in her seat. The smile gone now, replaced by something colder, more direct. "We will be discussing this," she said, each word precise, controlled, like she was already moving this out of the driveway and into a boardroom where she felt more comfortable. I stepped back from the gate, giving her space she did not actually need but expected anyway, and nodded once more. "You can try," I said, and then I turned slightly, not walking away, just shifting my stance, making it clear the conversation was over, that the gate was not going anywhere, and for a moment she just sat there, engine idling, the weight of the situation pressing in from all sides, the cars behind her, the steel in front of her, the realization that the shortcut she had relied on was no longer something she could simply assume existed. And then, slowly, she put the vehicle in reverse, the tires rolling back over the same packed dirt that had brought her here, the line behind her following suit one by one, the sound of engines fading in the opposite direction, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, like something had finally been decided. By mid-morning the silence did not last. It never does when you interrupt something people depend on, and I heard the first truck long before it reached the gate, slower this time, cautious, like the driver had already heard something was different, the engine idling uneven as it rolled up and stopped where the tire tracks used to continue without question. The driver leaned out, squinting at the steel like it might explain itself if he stared hard enough. I stayed where I was on the porch, coffee in hand now, letting the distance do the talking for me. He did not get out, did not ask, just shook his head slightly and backed up, turning around with a tight maneuver that sent loose gravel scattering. And then he was gone, followed by another and another, each one repeating the same pattern. Approach, pause, realization, retreat, and with each turnaround the path lost a little more of its meaning. The packed dirt no longer a road but a dead end that people had not accounted for. Around 10 o'clock the phone buzzed against the wooden railing beside me. Sharp and sudden in the quiet. Unknown number, local area code. I let it ring once more before picking it up. "Ethan Caldwell?" I said, keeping it simple. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to feel deliberate. Then her voice came through, smooth but tighter than before, controlled in a way that suggested she had already had this conversation in her head a dozen times. "This is Victoria Hale," she said, not asking if I knew who she was, assuming it. "We need to talk about the obstruction you installed this morning." Obstruction, not gate, not property, just a problem to be removed. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue before answering. "You can call it whatever you want," I said. "It is still mine." Another pause, shorter this time, like she was adjusting her approach. "You are interfering with established community access?" she continued, the words sounding rehearsed now, like they had been pulled straight out of a handbook or a meeting. "There are expectations in place that you are not considering." Expectations, that word hung there for a second, heavier than it should have been, because it was the closest thing she had to an argument, not law, not ownership, just expectation. I leaned back against the porch post, the wood pressing solid against my shoulder, grounding, real. "Show me the easement," I said, cutting straight through it, no build-up, no negotiation, just the one thing that would actually matter. The silence on the other end stretched longer this time, and I could almost hear the shift, the moment where she realized the conversation was not going where she wanted it to go. "This is not about paperwork," she said finally, and there it was, the crack widening, because it always comes back to paperwork when you're talking about land, always. "It is about community function," she added, her tone sharpening slightly, like she was pushing harder now, trying to regain ground. I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but close. Enough to feel like one. "Then your community should have bought the land," I said, and the words landed clean, simple, impossible to twist into something else. Another pause, but this one carried something different, something colder. "We will be reviewing this situation formally," she said, each word measured again, but now there was an edge under it. Not just control but warning, like she was moving this out of conversation and into something bigger, something she believed she had more control over. I nodded to myself even though she could not see it. "You do that?" I replied, and I ended the call before she could add anything else, the screen going dark in my hand as the quiet settled back in around me, but it was not the same quiet as before. This one had tension in it, anticipation, like the next move had already been set in motion somewhere else. I set the phone down and walked back toward the gate, boots kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the warm air, and when I reached it I rested my hand against the steel, the surface already warming under the sun, solid, unmoving, exactly what it needed to be. I looked down the path toward the subdivision. No cars now, no movement, just the faint outline of where people used to pass through without thinking, and I could almost feel the shift happening on the other side, conversations starting, complaints stacking up, schedules being thrown off by 10 extra minutes that suddenly mattered a lot more than they used to. Inconvenience has a way of making people loud, especially when they have never had to deal with it before. I walked the line of the fence again, checking the posts, the chain, the lock, not because I thought something would fail, but because I wanted to see it from every angle, understand exactly what I had changed. And as I circled back to the gate I noticed something new, a pair of fresh tire marks stopping just short of the steel, closer than the others had gotten, the tracks angled slightly, like the driver had considered going around, testing the edges, looking for a weakness, but there was none, just open land and the clear message that this was no longer a path you could take without consequence. I stood there for a moment longer, the wind brushing past, carrying the faintest echo of distant traffic from the main road, the longer way around, the way they were all going to have to get used to now, and I realized something simple, something that had not been true yesterday. Every minute they spent driving that extra distance was a reminder, not of me, but of the fact that they had been using something that was never theirs in the first place, and that realization does not sit quietly for long. The letter arrived just after noon, slid halfway under the front door like it belonged there, thick paper, clean edges, the kind that carries more weight than it should for something so light. I picked it up without rushing, already knowing who it was from before I even saw the return address. Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, printed in that polished font that tries to look official without actually being authority. I turned it over once in my hands, feeling the stiffness of the envelope, then opened it slowly, the tear sounding louder than it should in the quiet house. Inside was exactly what I expected. Structured paragraphs, formal tone, Words like unauthorized obstruction, community disruption, and immediate compliance required, all lined up neatly like they could replace actual ownership if arranged correctly. I leaned against the kitchen counter as I read, the smell of paper and ink mixing faintly with the leftover coffee, and when I reached the part that mentioned potential legal action, I could not help the small exhale that escaped me, not frustration, not concern, just recognition. Because this was familiar territory, different land, same tactic, pressure first, facts later, if at all. I folded the letter back along its crease and set it down flat on the counter, smoothing it with my palm like it was something that needed to be kept intact. Then I reached for my laptop, the keys clicking softly as I opened the same county records page from earlier, but this time I went deeper, not just my parcel, the surrounding ones, the subdivision itself, pulling up plats, overlays, anything that showed lines, rights, limitations. The digital map spread out in front of me, clean, precise, indifferent to what people thought should be true, and I traced the boundary where my land met theirs, zooming in until the pixels sharpened into clear divisions. And there it was again. Nothing, no shared access, no recorded easement, no conditional use, just a hard line that had been ignored long enough to feel invisible. I leaned back slightly, chair creaking under the shift, and let the silence settle while I double-checked everything. Because if there was one thing I had learned, it was that confidence comes from knowing exactly where you stand before someone tries to move you. Outside, a faint engine passed on the distant main road, the longer route, the one they were all taking now whether they liked it or not, and I pictured the extra miles adding up, the minutes stretching, the small inconvenience turning into a daily reminder that something had changed. My phone buzzed again, this time a text, unknown number, same area code. You need to remove the gate immediately. This is not how things work here. No name, no introduction, just assumption, just expectation packaged as instruction. I stared at it for a second, then set the phone down without replying because there was nothing in that message worth engaging with, no argument, no fact, just habit trying to reassert itself. I went back to the screen, scrolling through archived documents, older filings, anything that might explain how this shortcut had started in the first place, and after a few minutes I found it, a faded survey note from over a decade ago, a temporary access path marked during early construction of the subdivision, labeled clearly as non-permanent, intended only for equipment and initial development traffic. A solution that was supposed to disappear once the main roads were completed, but it never had. It had stayed, been used, normalized, adopted without ever being formalized, and now it had become something they believed they owned simply because it had existed long enough. Without challenge, I sat there for a moment staring at that single line on the screen, the origin of all of this, and it made everything clearer. This was not about misunderstanding, it was about convenience evolving into entitlement. I printed the document, the machine whirring to life with a low mechanical hum, the paper sliding out warm to the touch, and I placed it next to the HOA letter on the counter, two versions of reality side by side, one built on assumption, the other on record, and I did not need to decide which one mattered more. The answer was already there, outside. A car slowed near the gate, tires crunching softly before coming to a stop. I walked to the window and looked out, a different vehicle this time, not the white SUV, just someone else caught in the same routine. The driver sat there for a second, then leaned forward, reading the small sign I had attached earlier, private property and no trespassing, simple, direct, no room for interpretation. After a moment the car shifted into reverse, backing away the same way the others had, and as it disappeared from view, I picked up the HOA letter again, folded it once more and slid it into a drawer, not discarded, not ignored, just filed where it belonged, because whatever they thought this was going to become, I already knew how it ended, not with raised voices or drawn-out arguments, but with something much simpler, a line that had always been there finally being respected. The knock came just after 3 in the afternoon, sharp and deliberate, not the kind you make when you are unsure, but the kind that assumes the door will open because it always has. I was already halfway there when it came again, louder this time, the sound echoing through the empty space of the house. I opened the door without rushing and found her standing there, Victoria Hale, closer now than she had been by the gate, the details sharper, the lines in her expression more defined, the sunglasses gone, replaced by a direct stare that carried none of the practiced softness from earlier. Behind her, 2 other figures lingered near the edge of the driveway, both dressed like they had stepped out of a meeting, clipboards in hand, observing more than participating. The air between us felt different up close, thicker, like something had moved from inconvenience into confrontation. "We are here to resolve this," she said without greeting, her voice measured, but there was a strain. Underneath it now, something that had been building since the morning. I leaned one shoulder lightly against the doorframe, keeping my stance relaxed. It looks resolved from where I am standing, I replied, and I could see the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her jaw set just a fraction harder, small details, but enough to show that the control she relied on was slipping in places she was not used to. She glanced back briefly at the two people behind her, then stepped forward just enough to reclaim the space. You have blocked a route that dozens of homeowners rely on daily, she continued, each word precise, structured, like she was presenting a case rather than having a conversation. This affects commute times, emergency access, property value perception. She listed them like they were interchangeable, like stacking them together would create something that outweighed ownership. I let the words settle without interrupting, then nodded once, slow, acknowledging the effort without agreeing with the premise. That route was never yours, I said, keeping it simple, because simplicity has a way of cutting through things that are built on layers. She inhaled slightly, a controlled breath, then shifted tactics. There are established expectations within this community, she said again, returning to the same argument from a different angle, as if repetition might eventually turn it into something stronger. I pushed off the frame and stepped just outside onto the porch, closing the distance by a small margin. Not enough to challenge, just enough to change the dynamic. Expectations do not override property lines, I replied, and for a second the space went quiet, the faint rustle of wind through the grass the only sound filling the gap between us. One of the people behind her shifted weight, the soft scrape of a shoe against gravel breaking the stillness. I could feel their presence now, not just observers, but witnesses to something that was not going the way it usually did. Victoria's posture stiffened slightly, and when she spoke again there was less polish, more edge. We have legal avenues we can pursue, she said, the statement landing more like a warning now than a fact. I nodded again, the motion small, controlled. So do I answered, and I reached back inside for a moment, grabbing the printed document from the counter, the paper still slightly warm from earlier. I held it out toward her without stepping closer, letting her decide if she wanted to take it. After a brief hesitation she did, her fingers brushing the edge as she pulled it free, her eyes scanning the page quickly at first, then slowing as she read the note, the temporary access designation, the expiration tied to construction completion, the lack of any permanent easement. I watched the shift happen in real time, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable, the way her focus narrowed, the way the confidence she had been leaning on adjusted under new information. She looked up from the page, meeting my eyes again, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because everything that needed to be said was already there in the space between us. Finally she exhaled quietly and handed the paper back, her movements precise, measured. This is not over, she said, the tone quieter now, less performative, more direct, like she was acknowledging a setback without conceding the outcome. I took the paper and folded it once, sliding it back into my pocket. It already is, I replied, not raising my voice, not adding emphasis, just stating it the way you state something that does not need to be argued. Behind her the two observers exchanged a brief glance, something unspoken passing between them, and then the moment shifted again, not back to control, but into something else. Something less certain. Victoria held my gaze for another second, then turned without another word, the gravel crunching under her heels as she walked back toward her vehicle. The two others following a step behind, quieter now, less sure of their role. I stood there until the engine started, the low hum filling the space once more, and watched as the car pulled away, not toward the gate, but toward the longer road, the one they had been avoiding for years. And as the sound faded into the distance, the silence that followed felt different again. Not just settled, but reinforced, like something that had been tested and held exactly the way it was built to. The next morning did not come quietly. It never does after you disrupt something people thought was permanent. And I heard them before I saw them again, not just one engine this time but several, layered, uneven, the kind of sound that carries tension in it, impatience building before the problem even comes into view. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug in my hand, the ceramic warm against my fingers, and looked out across the path just as the first car crested the rise. Slowing earlier than before, word had spread, that much was clear. The driver stopped a good 20 feet from the gate this time, not testing it, not hoping it might be gone, just acknowledging the reality of it from a distance. Behind him the line stacked faster than it had yesterday. Vehicles bunching up in a way that felt tighter, less organized, like routine had been replaced with uncertainty. Doors started opening, one after another, people stepping out onto the packed dirt, stretching, looking around, trying to process something that had already been decided for them. I could hear voices now, low at first, then rising as more joined in, fragments carried on the wind. This is ridiculous. He cannot just do this. It has always been open. The same words in different tones, disbelief trying to hold its ground against something solid. I stayed where I was, not hiding, not approaching, just present, because this was not a conversation that needed me to explain anything further. The gate was already doing that. A man in a blue button. Down walked closer, stopping a few feet from the chain, hands on his hips as he studied it like it was a problem he could solve if he looked long enough. "You the owner?" he called out, his voice carrying across the space. I nodded once, setting the mug down on the railing beside me. "That is right," I said. Keeping my tone level, he exhaled sharply, glancing back at the line of cars behind him, then back at me. "People got places to be," he said, not aggressive, just stating what he believed should matter most. I stepped off the porch and walked a few paces closer, stopping well short of the gate, the distance intentional, controlled. "Then they should take the road that belongs to them," I replied, and the words landed the same way they had yesterday, simple, unchangeable. A woman near the back of the group shook her head, arms crossed tight. "This is not how this works," she said, echoing Victoria without even realizing it, like the idea had already been passed around and accepted as truth. I let my gaze move across the group for a second, taking in the different reactions, frustration, confusion, annoyance, but underneath all of it something else starting to surface. Realization, slow but steady, the kind that builds when a pattern breaks and does not immediately fix itself. A horn sounded again, longer this time, not directed at me but at the situation itself, pressure building from behind, pushing forward without anywhere to go. And then, just like that, the white SUV appeared at the edge of the line, not at the front, not leading this time, but working its way forward as people shifted to make room. Victoria stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped, her movements quicker than before, less composed, the gravel crunching under her heels as she moved toward the gate, toward me, the crowd parting slightly without being asked, giving her space out of habit more than respect. She stopped a few feet from the chain, her eyes moving from the lock to the posts to the line of cars behind her, taking it all in at once, the scale of the disruption now visible in a way it had not been yesterday. "This is escalating," she said, her voice carrying just enough for the others to hear, not a private statement, but one meant to frame the moment. I tilted my head slightly, considering the word, then shook it once. "No," I said, "this is settling." And that was when the shift happened, not loud, not dramatic, but clear. The conversations behind her slowed, voices dropping as people started to listen. Not because I raised mine, but because the situation had reached a point where something had to give. She looked at me for a long second, searching for something, an opening, a hesitation, anything she could use to push this back into the shape she wanted. But there was nothing there to grab onto, just the same answer she had already been given, backed by steel and paper and the simple fact that the land under our feet did not belong to her. A man near the front sighed loudly and turned back toward his car, the sound cutting through the tension like a decision being made. One by one the others followed, doors closing, engine starting, the line unraveling in reverse, not all at once, but steadily, each person choosing the longer road because it was the only road left. Victoria stayed where she was for a moment longer, watching them go, the reality of it settling in piece by piece. Then she turned back toward me, her expression no longer trying to hide what it was, not anger exactly, but something close to it, something sharper. "This is not over?" she said again, quieter this time, almost to herself. I met her gaze without stepping forward, without changing my stance. "It never was," I replied, and as she turned and walked back to her vehicle, the sound of her engine joining the others heading the long way around, the land, finally felt like it was mine. Not because I said it was, but because for the first time, everyone else was acting like it was too. By the third morning the sound never came back, no engines cutting across the dirt, no tires grinding over gravel that did not belong to them, just wind moving slow across 60 acres that finally felt like it could breathe again. I stepped out onto the porch before sunrise, the air cooler now, carrying that faint scent of dry grass and open space that had been buried under routine for who knows how long, and I stood there for a while without moving, just listening. Because silence like that does not happen by accident, it happens when something has been corrected. Down by the gate the steel caught the early light, edges sharp, unmoving, exactly where I had left it, no fresh tire marks, no signs of anyone testing it overnight, just the same line ending where it was supposed to end. I walked down slowly, boots pressing into ground that was already starting to loosen, the packed path softening at the edges now that it was not being reinforced every morning. Nature reclaiming something that had been forced into shape by repetition. I ran my hand along the chain. The metal cool under my fingers, solid, unchanged, and for a second I thought about how simple it really was. Not the process, not the pushback, just the principle. Ownership is not loud, it does not need to be. It just needs to be clear. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A new email, subject line clean and direct. Notice of withdrawal. I opened it standing there by the gate. The words straightforward, no extra framing, no pressure this time, just a statement that the Homeowners Association would not be pursuing further action regarding the access route across my property. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had been assumed before, just a quiet step back. I read it once, then again, not because I needed to, but because I recognized what it represented, not defeat in the way they might have seen it, but acceptance, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to argue against. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked out toward the subdivision, still hidden beyond the rise, still operating on its own rules, its own expectations, but no longer reaching into something that was not part of it. The longer road would be busy now. I could almost picture it, cars lined up, schedules adjusted, routines rewritten around a reality that had always been there but had finally been enforced. I turned and walked back toward the house, the gravel under my boots sounding different now, not like something being used, but something belonging, each step grounded in a way it had not been before. Later that afternoon I drove out to the county road for supplies, passing the entrance to the subdivision on my way, and for the first time I saw it from their side, the line of cars waiting to turn, engines idling, people checking the time, adjusting to a delay they could no longer avoid. No one looked my way as I passed, no one waved, no one tried to make eye contact, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to argue, just a situation that had settled into place. I picked up what I needed and headed back, the truck humming steady as the land opened up again in front of me, wide and uninterrupted. When I pulled into my driveway, the gate stood exactly as it had that morning, unchanged, unapologetic, and I stopped for a moment before getting out, looking at it not as a barrier, but as a line that had finally been respected. I stepped out, the late afternoon sun warming the back of my neck, and walked over to it one more time, not to check it, not to adjust anything, just to stand there and take in what it meant now that everything had played out. The path behind it was already starting to fade, edges softening, the illusion of a road breaking down into what it had always been, just a stretch of land someone else had decided to use. I rested